Hello guys, today we will talk about integrations. So let's just start thinking what is integration actually in Salesforce. So in Salesforce we have a couple of use cases related to integration. First of them is when we need to do a callout from Salesforce to some external system to get the data or to push the data to that system, or when some external system trying to make a callout to Salesforce to push some data or get some data. So there could be different, let's say, use cases that's trying to cover these schemas, like for example synchronization between Salesforce and external DB, synchronization between currency exchange platform and the current rate and Salesforce, and so on and so forth. So there are different combination of possible actions that we might have. Another good example is when we created a record in Salesforce, we need to, for example, make a post in social media that, like, hey, we have something new for you guys to share. And there are a bunch of different other topics and items. Let us just start a little bit and discuss what we have in terms of instruments available in Salesforce for that. So first of all, in the Salesforce we have a possibility to make HTTP callouts to external system. We have a possibility to use different APIs, like for example SOAP or REST. Let's say at this moment, as I could see based on my experience, everyone mostly using REST for everything, and SOAP not so popular at this time, but it still exists, let's say. Also we have a possibility to write in the Salesforce Apex classes where we could provide some kind of custom functionality for situation when somebody needs to invoke that custom API from Salesforce and provide some custom logic. Also we have standard APIs. So standard APIs in Salesforce are actually provided for different kind of stuff, like for example for possibility to get a subject information, or possibility to push some object into the DB, or patch that object, or delete that object, or for example perform bulk operations. So there are different kind of APIs available for us to use them for integration purpose. So as you could see, there could be different use cases where you need to integrate your Salesforce org with some another platform. So what is a, let's say, common behavior in all of this stuff? So because we are trying to integrate two different platforms, so that means that we need to take care about the security, because if you could make a callout to external system, or for example to Salesforce, then like everyone can, right? So then how we could make sure that we are secure in this moment? So for us to make sure that everything is secure, we need to use proper authorization method, right? First of all, to get access to the specific API, and second, it's for us to confirm who we are, so who is trying to get access to that platform. Because let's imagine if you are in Salesforce and there are different kind of persons who is trying to access that API, it will be great for you to understand who is actually calling your Salesforce instance to perform some kind of operations. And because of that, in the integrations we have such kind of mechanism which is called authorization. So when we're trying to authorize from one server to another, usually we need to have apply one of authorization mechanism, like for example out 2.0 or out 1.0a, or some another technique, or even basic authorization when we are providing the explicit user name and password. And all this stuff allowing us to understand on the platform who actually is trying to log in, and based on that user who is just trying to log in, we could take a look what is, let's say, his permissions. Let's say, do we in general allow him to insert the data or update the data, or that user have just limited access. So when we're using authorization in the Salesforce, we have different kind of, let's say, mechanism where we could actually store our authorization related data. So in the past there was, let's say, popular method to store integration settings in the custom setting, but then because of the security purpose what was started to be used, it's kind of let's say packages, where we could store our consumer key, consumer secret, and login URL and all this stuff, because we would like to this data not to be accessible via, let's say, for it to be security stored in the Salesforce, because if it's stored in the custom setting, so that means that any kind of system admin could actually go and open that specific custom setting. So then also there was a custom metadata and all this stuff. So why I'm mention the packages, it's because if you installed specific package that allow you to store credentials, if that specific custom settings have in setting of it that it should be not visible, because it's, you know, like just on the package level of visibility, right? So that means that only specific, let's say, methods or codes or specific page provide access actually to those settings, and it's hidden from everyone, right? So that means that you could insert into that custom setting, or you could read from that custom setting only via specific methods or just with a specific admin page, and if so, then you could configure access to that page. So another possible usage is you could use named credential, which is more secure at this moment, and what is cool about it, it's on the code level. Once you will contains in the named credentials in the Salesforce all of kind of, let's say, secure information. So then even on the code level you just need to mention your named credentials name and just it. So in the code level there will be not much which you're mentioning in terms of code, right? And it's good in terms of security. So also one additional item which is available in the Salesforce, it's connected app. So if for any reason you need to have a connected app and you need to generate consumer key and consumer secret, so for that purpose in the Salesforce we could use connected apps. So you could generate them once they are created, or maybe during the creation you could specify what kind of actually permissions you would like to assign to be available through this connected app. Like for example, you could specify is it should be full access or not full access, should the user be able to modify its own data, and so on and so forth. So there are different kind of items that you could configure, and on top of it what you could else do is you could decide if you would like to enforce API restrictions or if you would like to relax API restrictions. So it's up to you to decide, and in that case what is possible for you to do is you will have restricted let's say APIs list. So in that case you could just allow, let's say, certain users in the specific range of IPs to be able to use this specific let's say logic. So I think that at this moment, in terms of the basics related to authorizations, that's it. Of course there are some other techniques, but at this moment we just discussed basics. Let's jump on another level. What kind of APIs are actually available at this moment on Salesforce out of the box, and is it possible for us to write a custom? So at this moment Salesforce provide different kind of APIs, and if you're interested in them, what you could do is you could actually Google or take a look into the Salesforce documentation, and there you will be able to find different kind of APIs. So for example, if you will Google for REST APIs available for Salesforce, you will be able to see that there are different APIs that provide you access for a subject. So that means that if somebody requests you, for example, for API where they would like to create a cases in the Salesforce, or for example some another object, like for example opportunity, so that means that you could point them to that standard API, right? And they will be able to read from the documentation what is required for them to authorize, and then for them to push and what kind of parameters that specific API accept. Also on top of it, what is possible in the Salesforce is we could write our own custom web services. So when we let's say write in our custom REST service on the Salesforce, we could specify what should be its base URL. Let's say we could define if we would like to support versioning. So versioning we actually supporting when we specify the URL of our REST resource. Like for example, if it's API for the incident creation or cases creation, so there could be something case creation /v1, right? And once you will release more advanced version, you will be able to use v2 and so on and so forth, right? And in that case, you will be able to allow a couple of, let's say, APIs related to the same logic to be existing in the Salesforce. So they will coexist, and you will be able to actually use them together, right? For example, one client using more advanced API because he let's say more priority client, and another one using just some reduced version or wherever. So it's up to you to decide. So if in Salesforce we could write a custom web services, what is possible for us to actually do in these web services? So because, for example, if you will take a look into the REST as an example, here we have a possibility for us to specify different kind of methods. I think if you was able to work with APIs, you was able to see that there are different kind of HTTP methods available, like for example HTTP GET for you to be able to get information from some source, HTTP POST if you would like to push information to some source, and you providing in the body some kind of payload related to that specific request. So all this kind of stuff you could actually organize in the Salesforce, so you could read more in the documentation related to HTTP request what kind of methods are actually supported, but it's possible to organize logic there. So we could, let's say, take a look into one example related to integration. You might ask, like if in Salesforce we have standard API, for example, to create a subject, why we need to write a custom? So in that case, we have an example. Let's imagine that the external user or external system should be able to create incident record in the Salesforce and attach it to it multiple cases. And the way how it's doing so, it's creating incident record and providing in the payload IDs of those cases that should be linked to the specific record in the Salesforce. So what is possible for you to do via the, let's say, standard API, right? It's you could make an agreement with that, let's say, person or that system who is doing call out to Salesforce and ask them to push those IDs of the cases into one of the fields on the cases. And for example, you will create a custom field and it will have a name related cases, right? And what they will be able to do, they will be able to push their related cases IDs into that specific field, right? And they will push it into the standard Salesforce API for DML. So in that case, what you will be able to do is you will be able to write a trigger on that specific, let's say, insert of the case. And based on that field, you will be able to, let's say, parse it, or you will be able to read information from that field. You will be able to split it via comma or wherever will be delimiter, and you will be able to actually generate necessary records as a part of the trigger. But if there will be some kind of different situation when there will be, let's say, tons of the cases which you could not put into one field, of course you could create 2, 3 wherever fields that you need, or what you could do is you could write your custom logic, right? And in your custom logic you could provide, let's say, readable structures that, for example, they are providing incident information, and then they are providing, let's say, array with the cases IDs. And in that case, your custom logic will be able to just parse it, that specific array, let's say, and based on it do necessary operations. So, and let's imagine that it's not just it, and you, for example, just need to make a post when this operation is required, completed, for example, via chatter to system administrator. So you could do so, and you could add that specific code into your custom REST, right, web service. But as you could see here are also different kind of approaches, right? Because if you will talk about this chatter post, what is else possible, it's also possible for you to add it in the trigger. So that's why you always needs to be dedicated to what actually needs to be done at the end, right? And is it possible for you to, let's say, use already existing as object a piece, or you need to write your custom one? So we discussed some basic around it, and now let's maybe discuss about next part. So next part related to the following situations, that when we're doing our HTTP callouts from one system to another. There might be situation when some system is down, for example, for a couple of minutes or for an hour or wherever, or it's, for example, could not parse our payload, or for example, it's not support some specific method, or for example, it jumped from one API version to another, and you need to be able to actually handle all these kind of possible issues. So there are a couple of techniques that you could apply. Actually, of course, you always need to have error handling. And in general, for error handling, what is good for us to do, it's because we are talking about API, right? So when we are talking about API, we already have in our code level, let's say, request and response, and we could actually parse it, get our response status code, and if our status code will be equal to something which is related to error, what we could do in that case, we could use separate object in the Salesforce to store all our, let's say, org related issues and have on that object different record types. So those different record types will help us to structure how our actually log object look for different kind of issues. Let's say that you have different kind of functionality where you require a little bit different log level, and for example, in that case, your log object will look like this. So you have your log object, and there will be a couple of record types, like for example, let me think about some example, like for example, case, synchronization, logic, log, API, incident creation API, log, and so on and so forth. So you got the main idea, I think, that, you know, like if you have different structure of your errors and you need to contain it in different fields, so then you could use that object and you could use record types. So when you have different record types, you could assign different layouts, you could assign different fields, different pick list values, and so on and so forth. So you could fully use basic capacity of Salesforce, right, in terms of the object maintenance. And in that case, in terms of the API, what is will required for you to do, it's you will need to actually store your error once it will appear in that log object. And what you could do on top of it, it's if in your Salesforce organization you have some kind of administrators or IT team or wherever, right? It's you could apply different kind of techniques. When a new error related to, for example, case synchronization is happening, so then you are sending a mail to the specific case synchronization team, or you, for example, notifying some manager with a specific role related to that department. So when it's APIs and you're notifying another team, it could be via chat report or via email or wherever, right? Any kind of, I think, let's say what you could have in your head, right? So it depends on your organization what you would like to apply, but you see the actual let's say benefits from that approach. It's you have a possibility for you to track actually all of kind of errors related to your project in one unified place. You could report on it, you could perform notification on it, and you could actually see, for example, how many times your API is failing, what is the basic reason, how you could achieve it, how you could fix it, right? And on the daily stand-ups, your specific team could actually, let's say, take an action on it, right? And if some specific manager will have dashboard or report on it, where he will be able to monitor it, of course, he will be able to understand what is, let's say, right actions that need to be done for you to reduce the number of issues that you are usually having with that specific API. Or logic. So next good items that we need to consider always when we are doing APIs, it's possibility for us to actually do auto retry. So let's imagine that you have your API which needs to synchronize some data between one platform and another as soon as possible. So what is a possible actions for you to do? First possible action is you could implement this retry. So auto retry logic could be specified in your custom metadata, where you could specify, let's say, how many times you would like your system to perform a retry when some external endpoint is, you know, like not reachable, or for example, what is the timeout between your retries, and so on and so forth. So if you just prepare that custom metadata, so then on your code you could implement it, and that means that if you will make a call out to some external system which is down at this moment, So then you could do retry in 1 minute, then another retry in 1 minute, and only after that you, for example, could log an error. So it's possible for you to do so with the help of, let's say, the Z technique, with a technique related to retry. One another point that I would like to discuss is related to actually the way how we are building our API, because we have different, let's say, techniques that we could apply for our integrations. If one technique, for example, synchronize one record per time, so another technique, what it should allow us to do is, for example, it could allow us to synchronize tons of records per time. So that means that there could be different techniques that we are applying for us to actually be able to do so. Like, for example, if in the first case it could be simple callout on your Apex trigger, which will make API call to external system, and for you to just make sure that you are separating context. You could mark it with a feature keyword, right, for it to work in a synchronous context, or you could push your callout into the queuable class and then invoke it from your Apex trigger. So whatever technique that you will apply could help you to bring your data to external platform. So another possible technique is when you have in Salesforce different kind of records, let's say, and there are a lot of them that you need to synchronize to external platform. So in that case, what is possible for you to do, it's, for example, to write and batch, and your batch will take a look for any new or any not synchronized yet records. So what does it mean? So it means that each time when you have your record in Salesforce created or updated, and some triggering point, or some triggering field for integration is updated, or it's created initially, so then what you could do is you could mark a specific checkbox, or for example datetime field, which will represent that specific record is require, let's say, synchronization, so it should be synchronized to external platform. So in that case, what is possible for you to use, it's use schedule plus batch. So in that case, your scheduler will work, for example, every half of hour. It will take a look what is new records in the Salesforce system and what needs to be actually synchronized. So once it will synchronize your records, so what it should do, it should uncheck that specific checkbox from your records that it requires synchronization, and only when next time the specific triggering field will be updated, so only the time that the checkbox will be set again. So for example, that checkbox, setting one update on the triggering field could be done via record triggered flow, and the specific integration could be done via the batch. And in that case, because you are using the batch and you are using the specific let's say allowed callouts interface, right? So in that case, your batch will be able to do necessary callouts, and because it will be executed in the synchronous manner, so that means that you will not reach Salesforce platform limits. So in that case, you could see there are two different techniques, right? First of them, it's when we are each time doing a callout after some record is updated, but when we have tons of records, we don't want to, make tons callouts separately. We would like to combine them together and perform, let's say, some bulk synchronization with external system. So next topic that we need to discuss, guys, is because we are working in the Salesforce ecosystem, so what is we usually have? Right, it's limits. So if you have any limits, so that means that we always need to take care about it. And that means that if you would like to check what is kind of API limits we have in Salesforce, so that means that you need to go to the company organization settings. You could take a look what kind of limits are actually available for your organization, what is the number of API calls for months or per 24 hours. And you will be able to understand what kind of volume, right, you could handle with your specific edition. And in that case, you will be able to think and properly design your, let's say, integration pattern. Because without it, if you will just not let's say consider it, right, and if you, for example, each time will use only one record for synchronization, that means that each record will use one API call, right? And if it will be one API call, in that case, it will mean that if during the month you have the number of records which is bigger than this number of available callouts for you, so in that case, not all your data will be really synchronized. And this batchable approach should work for you much better. So in that case you will be able to just combine different records. But you see that here another, let's say, problem with this possible delay, like for example, if your batch will work every half of hour or every 50 minutes, so in that case there will be some possible delays, but I don't believe that it's so critical. But it's again really depend on the situations that you have on your project and what is the business logic behind it. So next topic that I would like to mention is when you guys working on APIs or you are creating your let's say custom one, please make sure that you are specifying right responses, right response code and so on and so forth, because it's really important for you to be aligned on the, let's say, general standards. And if you integrate in with external system, right, you already, when you're parsing their response, you also respecting or awaiting for some specific status code to come back to you, and based on this status you could understand if operation is, working fine, or if operation is not working well, right? So in that case, even when you creating your custom API, so please make sure that you are doing the same, and when you're providing back, let's say, error messages or response, right, about that something was wrong, so please provide that information in understandable format. Like for example, that record could not be inserted because, right, and there should be some explanation. Or if, for example, some collection of records was sent to you and you inserted all of them except of one, so in that case you need to provide back that information that, hey, for example, mostly that operation is completed, but some record was not inserted because of the following reasons. So in that case it will be always understandable for, like color, what needs to be corrected. And as I mentioned, when we will use that specific technique, when we have a specific object which is capturing all of these kind of issues, right? So in that case you could imagine that some person will be able to review it correctly, and they will be able to modify their data or wherever and do some kind of data pre-validation prior to synchronization, which will make sure that integration will work properly in that case. So we are talking about the statuses, about error messages on the code level. So next items that I would like to discuss, it's of course documentation related to your API. Because sometimes, let's say, API is changed, and I was able to see that not always people support versioning. Not sure why on Salesforce they not doing so, because it's so easy to just create different classes with different, let's say, source URL, which will be pointing to the same API but with different version, right, at the end, as I just mentioned, with this v1 and v2 at the end. So that's why it's not a problem at all. But in that case, if API is changed, let's say you're working, you specified your integration with some specific endpoint, right, and it was working for years, and after that it stopped working, and you're just wondering why. So you could potentially observe that it's not working because that API is changed or URL is changed or wherever. So it will be great that if prior to that, what will happen, that specific API response will for example, always notify the actual customers about that situation, that hey, for example, in 1 month that specific API version will expire. Please make sure that you reroute your API to work with version 2 of our API. So in that case it will be really great for persons to get that information in advance. And again, if you will think about our technique, right, which we mentioned with error logging framework, so in that case you will be able to easily track when it will just appear. And if you will just go back to our topic that we started to discuss, which is related to documentation of API. So what is possible for us to do to document our API? It's, for example, we could even make one more public route related to our API, right, where persons will be able to perform a GET request and they will be able to get back entire documentation related to our project, related to our API. Or, for example, we could use online documentation, we could use documentation in the G2 with examples, we could use Confluence pages, or we could use a Swagger. So let's say kind of tool where we will be able to specify what should be our, for example, each supported method for our API, what kind of incoming parameters it's respect, example of, let's say, success operation, example of bad operation. In addition to that, what is sometimes different platforms doing is they are actually providing Postman collection. So if you open the Postman collection, you could find here good examples of how you could perform, for example, post request or get request to the specific API, what kind of payloads you could get, and you even could play with it, make a fork from the Postman and try and perform your own requests. So if we started to talk about documentation, right, and about possibility how we could test our API. So in Salesforce, where let's say we are usually creating an API and testing it on the initial stages, what is possible tools that we could use to test some requests. So first possible tool that we could use for that it's Workbench. So it's kind of tools that we are using for a big period of time, I think, and there we have tab with name REST Explorer. So when we are going to the tab, we could specify what is our endpoint URL in terms of Salesforce, of course, because it's tool for Salesforce, and we could specify what kind of, let's say, method, get, post, put, wherever, and we could specify what is our body in case of the post method. So once we specified all that information, we could click on execute and observe what kind of results we are actually getting from our API. Let's say it should be initial step for us to be able to test how our API is working and if everything working well. So next possible tool is if you would like to, let's say, fully test our API. It's what we could do. It's we could use Postman, what we just already discussed it, right? So when we have in use Postman, so that means that we are here, we'll need to apply our authorization. So once we will apply our authorization, so that means that we will be able to even test what kind of APIs range its respect and so on and so forth. So it will be more, let's say, more advanced level of testing of our API. And I think at this moment, guys, that's all in terms of quick introduction and quick overview for you for some kind of different stuff and techniques related to integration. Of course, there are much more, and maybe if I will have time, I will prepare another video. But at this moment, it will be great if you will be able to share, for example, in the comments under that video, what kind of integrations, guys, you're using in your project, what kind of custom services you was able to build. So it's always interesting because in the current world there are different kind of, like integration possible, and even we have in a lot of situations connectors where those connectors actually could let's say integrate Salesforce with other platforms. So maybe sometimes it's something that you need to consider first, like is it already existing connector which is allowing you to integrate your let's say system with Salesforce or Salesforce with some system, and maybe it's not necessary to do something else, right? So it's the first stuff. So second stuff, it's not always a connector, but in Salesforce we have a possibility to specify integrations, like for example external objects usage, right? And if you're using external object usage, so I think it will be another 5 minutes for that video for me to mention it, but anyway. So when we are using external objects, it have a possibility for us to, let's say, use some external DB with those objects as a part of, let's say, Salesforce. So you know that in Salesforce we have this global search with the possibility for us to search your records. When we find some record, we could modify it and we could change some field values and we could save it. So it's also possible with the Salesforce external objects if you will, let's say, connect through that approach, for example, with protocol or data, right? For example, if that external DB will support that protocol, so that means that we could actually connect our Salesforce to that specific external database through that protocol, and then Salesforce will be able to operate with records related to that specific object in the Salesforce, how it's, for example, exists in Salesforce. So in that case, it will be much more easier. I was able to test it, and even in the past with guys we were developing, let's say, kind of integration like this, where we were able to connect external object to Salesforce, and people were able to use it, for example, as a part of Salesforce. And it was pretty cool when you could just modify records from external DB just directly in Salesforce and save them, and like you just get an additional space, like when you're using these external objects, but in the Salesforce they are available as regular objects. And if I remember correctly, we were able to even perform any kind of SQL queries and other stuff based on this, as it's a part of Salesforce. Of course, there was some maybe limitations, but at this moment I just do not remember it fully, because it was for a long time ago. But it's also for you guys to just consider, let's say, different kind of techniques, let's say, related to connectors, or for example, different ways how Salesforce could integrate with some external system. Like for example, in my videos on the channel, you should be able to see that I prepared different videos where there are different information related to, for example, integration with social media. So I showed a couple of techniques. Like for example, my latest video was related to possibility to do a post to the Twitter with the help of HTTP call, let's say, to the Twitter, right, and to creating a post directly. But also on my channel, I remember there were a different video where we are using social media channel in Salesforce from the Salesforce service setup, and we are specifying the specific, let's say, integration, which is also, like, two different ways for us to consider. And of course there are, like, the different cost for those solutions. So that's why you need to be very dedicated, let's say, when you're designing your integration, in case for you to understand what is, like, best approach. And in terms of, like, cost, there might be different kind of APIs where you are paying, for example, for the number of API calls, right, that you are making for that specific system. And of course, if in that case that system, let's say, allow bulk call, right, let's say, for you to synchronize a lot of records or get information about a lot of records, so better in that case to do that in that manner, right, and then do it individually, because the cost of that integration will be much more less than, like, when you are doing it in record by record basics. I have one more note for you guys. It's when during your integration you need to create an API user, please be very specific in the username of that, let's say, specific user, because if you have different kind of integration and all of them, let's say, using API user, so it definitely will be better for you to have different API users. In that case, you will be able to, first of all, easily debug it in, like, in isolation, your specific logic, which is related to only one API. And at the end, when you will take a look into the actual records, right, which is created via this API user, you will be able to, first of all, report on them, right, for you to be able to understand what is the volume, for example, of incoming records, or which API, let's say, causing more problems, and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, when you will just take a look into the, like, created by field, you will be able to easily and quickly recognize what was, the actual creator. Of course, there are, like, another technique that you could apply. It's, for example, if you will specify field on your object and you will put here some information, like, for example, reported method, right? And in this reported method, you will just capture what is your, let's say, API that invoking that specific, or, for example, which is cause that record creation, right? And in that case, for example, let's imagine that it's Google source, right, which is could bring you new records, or for example Yahoo or wherever. So in that case, you will be able to specify that field, source, or reported method on your object related to that specific platform. So in that case, even you could continue to use your, like, if you want, again, a unified user, but then on the record you will explicitly be able to understand from what system it was created, what was the, let's say, root cause for it, and how it's in general look like. At this moment, that's all, guys. Thank you for your attention. If there was something useful for you, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and cheers.